everyone, welcome to my series called Analyzing Christian, where I try to analyze Christian's many patterns, behaviors, habits, and what he is really trying to say at times. And please everybody, keep in mind that this series isn't about finding a definitive answer. It's more like Chris said something or did something, and here are my views and opinion on that, and what I think it all could mean from my perspective. And lastly, I would never excuse or pardon any of Chris's bad behaviors, because the end result is still the same. Chris still didn't pay any attention to what his teachers told him. And from the way that I look at all of this, Chris, as a consequence, poetically, is missing something very important. And since Chris doesn't realize that he is soul-starved, you could say, he doesn't seem to know how to find it. And I really hope, for Chris's sake, that he will find it before he hits his 50s or 60s. But how can he try to find it when he doesn't seem to realize what it is, or what it looks like, or what it could be? And whatever it may be, and how we find it, what it is, and what it means for us, that is something that each and every one of us need to find on our own. After all, the story of Christian, in my interpretation, is the story of a boy who wanted to be free, but he couldn't. Why? Allow me to explain, from my interpretation, why he couldn't be free. Because something like that is what today's analysis is about. It's about Chris and books. And I'm also going to bring up a what-if scenario to would there have been a difference if Chris actually sat down and read a book? Now, not much is known when it comes to Chris and literature, but based on what I've gathered on the Sonichu Wiki and what I've seen on a handful of YouTube documentaries, and especially from Gino Samuel. So, if I understand all of this correctly, when it comes to Chris and literature, and also with Chris's book of life, Chris's book of many misadventures, if you will, it goes something like this. Years ago, when Chris used to attend school, there is no doubt in my mind that the teachers from back then did try to get Chris into reading something. Whatever that could have been. I don't know. What it is that his teachers recommended him back then is not that known to me. But if we are talking about his kids' years, 7 to 9 years old as a starting point, then I'm guessing maybe Gulliver? Or Oliver Twist? Or Charlie and the Chocolate Factory? Maybe? And then, later on in his teens, I'm guessing the teachers may have recommended Shakespeare to Chris. Maybe. But I am not entirely sure what it was that his teachers recommended Chris to read. That is not known to me entirely. Because in Chris's case, when it comes to reading and education in general, I have to take into consideration that Chris was born and raised in America and not in Sweden. And thus, whatever they teach over there in the US, it's not the same as it is here in Sweden. It is not. I know. I realize this. As for if Chris had ever heard of or even read these aforementioned books and any other books I'm going to bring up later on, I actually don't think so. I don't think so. I don't think Chris has ever read that many books in his life. I don't even think that he's even read Shakespeare. one of the most fundamental English literatures in the history of ever. I don't think Chris has ever heard of or read any of the Harry Potter books or even seen the movies. I don't think so. And if the answer is no, then I'm just gonna be I'm gonna be at a loss for words here. I'm gonna be at a loss for words. I mean, I really would like to know. Honest question. Has Chris ever heard of or read any of the Harry Potter books? Or has Chris, at the very least, seen the movies? But if not Harry Potter, has Chris heard of or read the Lord of the Ring books? Or has he seen the movie adaptations? If, again, the answer is no, then I am really going to be at a loss for words. I am somebody who was born and raised here in Sweden, and back in the early and mid 2000s, both Harry Potter as well as the Lord of the Ring movies and the respected books were like crazy popular here in Sweden. The Harry Potter movie and the Lord of the Ring movie not only, coincidentally, released almost in the same time window here in Sweden, or almost, they also competed with each other. Everything about those two franchises were basically everywhere here in Sweden. And back in those days, in the early 2000s, there was no Wikipedia, there was no YouTube and no Spotify, because YouTube and Wiki and all that jazz came later on, in the mid 2000s. But as for Spotify, that came a bit later on. But, there was no staple social media back in those days and no YouTube. And I am very much bewildered and amazed how, without social media, without YouTube and Wikimedia, whatever, both Harry Potter and the Lord of the Rings thrived, even without YouTube and without Wikipedia, and as well thrived like crazy here in Sweden. That just baffles me. And the Harry Potter books, that is, the ones that me and my older brother had as kids, translated into Swedish, they are still in print to this very day, more than 20 plus years later. And again, for the last time, if Chris's answer is no, I never heard of Lord of the Ring or Harry Potter, then what exactly did Chris do back then? Like, I know Chris was born in the 1980s and, was not a kid in the late 90s, early 2000s. I do realize that. And since Chris was born in the 1980s, he doesn't have the same kind of childhood experiences and memories like those of my generation that was born in the early/mid 90s. Like, the thing me and Chris have in common is that both he and I grew up with Pokemon. But back then, Chris was already a teenager, I think, when Pokemon came around. Yeah, something like that. Or did Chris not hear about Harry Potter and Lord of the Rings because of, since Chris was born and raised in America, could it have been a difference in culture? Maybe? I mean, ladies and gentlemen, is there anybody who thinks of books when it comes to the USA? I don't think so, in my subjective opinion. When I think of the USA, I think of movies, like most a lot of people. When it comes to books, I think of Europe, and especially the UK and France. But anyways, I feel like I am derailing a little bit too much now, so let us get back on track to Chris, okay? Now, Chris has, to my knowledge, only read To Kill a Mockingbird by Lee Harper, rest in peace, and Goosebumps by R.L. Stine. And hey, I remember Goosebumps having a TV series on Fox Kids a super long time ago. But, when Chris was a kid, or a teenager, why didn't he read much books? Or at least one book a year at least? Many people, or rather popular belief, puts the blame on Chris's autism. And I can see why a lot of people would put the blame on that and why they would think that, but in my own subjective personal opinion, I think it is 50-50. I mean, just because one person has autism and he doesn't read much, or she, that person is not a representative of the AS community as a whole. Yes, there are some autistics that are severely lazy, and some autistics does have a stable reading habit, and some are, addicted to books. It depends on who it is. Really. But as I was saying about Chris and his autism, I get the impression that he is one of those autistics that can't sit still for more than 5 seconds and concentrate on his courses and readings. And as Chris is one of those autistics that can't concentrate that well, in Chris's school years, Chris may have lost his focus during class, and then, I assume, he probably pulled out his Game Boy and just played away the entire course or lecture. And then Chris just forgot about Shakespeare, or forgot about John Steinbeck, or forgot about Harper Lee, or whatever that is that North American students were encouraged to read, or at least read back then. Because of the reality that Chris has autism, Chris's parents never hired a social coach for him, or in this case a special kind of a teacher that knows how to educate a kid, teen, or young adult with autism. And as a consequence that Chris didn't get that kind of a help that he should have received back then, Chris, now years later, didn't develop a reading habit or for a particular taste in any kind of a genre in books. And I actually don't think that Chris has any interest in books at all. Well, maybe except for comic books, maybe, but comic books don't count that much. If I am not mistaken, Chris loses his concentration on classes, he didn't seem to pay much attention to his teachers, and he doesn't have a particular taste in books because the first half of the problem is, in a way, his autism, but it is not that simple because there was nobody there to coach him. It's not because he has autism that he can't read books at all. That's not how it is. It is more like, yes, Chris has autism, and it is easy to put the blame on when he doesn't concentrate or have an interest in, what ordinary people do on a day. But it is not that simple, because that autism needs to be nurtured by the right people. And if it is not nurtured by in the hands of the correct people, then of course Chris will grow up and be very much incomplete and not realize why. And he already is, by the way. He is very much incomplete. But his autism aside, the other half of the problem here has to do with, I think, with the fact that Chris is an 80s/90s kid, and back in those days, the hip and cool new thing at the time was MTV. And if you wanted to be, all rad to the max, man, and radical and be all surfer and skateboardy and what have you, books and glasses had to go. They were for, computer geeks and lame dorks and whatnot. And something. And I think at that time in Chris's childhood, I think Chris ate it up. Chris, in my opinion, wanted to be hip and cool, just like his hero, Sonic the Hedgehog. Rad to the max, man. And that is the other half of the problem to why Chris didn't want to read much books back then, it seems. The main problem is not solely on his autism. But if Chris didn't read actual books, then I am very certain that Chris knows about the now cancelled comic book series Archie Sonic, right? And maybe he does know about Sonic IDW, I presume, maybe. Now, a lot of people argue that if Chris did read books back then and did so in the here and now, then Chris would have been more intellectual and sophisticated, and he would not have ended up in jail. But in my subjective opinion, I actually argue against this notion, because Chris is, from the way I see this, he is that type of autistic that is very impressionable to what he sees on the TV, and in video games too, I think. And so, in my personal opinion, I don't think Chris would have benefited from reading books. I think reading for Chris, or if he was reading in the past, would have just had an opposite effect, because of the fact that he has a hard time distinguishing between fantasy and reality. I mean, before he was arrested, Chris was a couch potato, and he took mostly everything he saw on TV as fact, which includes cartoons, I think, and whatever he saw on the TV became a part of his reality. And who's to say that the alternative may have happened almost the same way? If, let's say, Chris read books and became an idle book boy, would he have believed that Hogwarts was real? Or would Chris believe that an unspeakable terror slumbers underwater? Cthulhu. Or would Chris believe that if a criminal was apprehended in the UK, would he think that that it was thanks to Sherlock Holmes? Or, last example, if Chris read books, would he have fancied himself as a messiah, which Chris actually thinks that he is right now, actually? For you see, before Chris was arrested, he took the Holy Bible as something literal. And this is why I argue that it would have been equally dangerous for Chris if he was an idle book boy instead of a couch potato or a gamer. If Chris would read a book right now, then I get the impression that he would have been all like, oh, okay, that's a nice story, I guess, whatever. And all of the book's motifs, messages, would just fly over Chris's head. Sadly. I argue that it wouldn't have made a difference either way if it was a video game like Pokemon or a book like Harry Potter. I think this is the case because, as a lot of people know, Chris is a fan of Pokemon, and one of Pokemon's main motifs has, for a long time, flown over Chris's head. Ladies and gentlemen, let's play a little game for 5 seconds. What is the main motif of Pokemon? And especially the main motif in the Pokemon anime? It's not gotta catch 'em all. And no, it's not about winning the tournament and being the very best, like no one ever was. No, one of Pokemon's main motifs, from my point of view, is the main character, Ash Ketchum, goes outside, meets new people, and gets to know the world and its many Pokemons. And that's what I think the Pokemon show is about. It's not just about catching Pokemons, from my point of view, in my interpretation. In the beginning, Ash had a simple goal in mind when he started his journey: get his starter Pokemon, catch a lot of Pokemons with the help of his tool. I mean, he started Pokemon, win a lot of badges, challenge the Elite Four, win the tournament so that he can become the very best, like no one ever was. And that would have been it. That was Ash's fantasy. But how it really went down in the Pokemon show was, in a nutshell, Ash and his starter Pokemon could not get along at first, but then, as they traveled, they became the best of friends. Ash even befriended his other Pokemons he caught. And along the road to the tournament, they met people, befriended them, and they traveled together, and Am I allowed to spoil the tournament for everyone? Spoilers if you haven't. So, Ash, with all of his badges, with all of his Pokemon and his friends, finally made it to the tournament. Only to lose. He lost. And so, in my interpretation of the Pokemon show, it was not a big deal that Ash lost, because Ash obtained something that he would never have obtained if everything was just that easy. Ash obtained the world. Yes, he, and I mean this poetically, started off as a fool, and then, after so many tests and trials, he obtained the world. You know, the fool's journey. And what I am poetically trying to say with all of this is, because of the harsh reality that nothing was handed to Ash, and because he went through this fool's journey and met new people, he became a stronger person for it. A better person. Ash did not treat his friends and Pokemons as tools. They meant a lot to him, and hey, Ash may have lost the tournament, but that's not the end of everything. The end of the tournament was only the beginning of a new journey. And who knows, maybe next time, next year, Ash probably will win the tournament. Who knows, maybe. This is something that his then rival, Gary Oak, did not obtain. Yes, Gary Oak was always one step ahead of Ash, always. But so what? At least Ash is Ash, and no one else. And so, what I'm really trying to say with all of this, in connection to Chris and literature, is, if you really want to know what your ultimate destiny is, you have to go outside, so that you can meet people, maybe help somebody out a little bit, teach them, and in return, they'll help you, or teach you. And voila, you made a new friend. And when you go outside, walking your own journey of life, you become a part of the world, and its ever-spinning cycle of history. Ash Ketchum doesn't become the very best by staying at home and watching TV all year and all day around. No, he becomes the very best by being a part of the world and its people. And also its Pokemon. And also, if I am not mistaken, I think the same story motif also applies to Dragon Ball. Or should I say, Dragon Ball Z? I mean, if Bulma never met Goku up in the mountains, then Goku would have grown up all alone, never knowing what happened to his quote-unquote grandpa, never realizing his origin, and he never would have learned of the Turtle School of Fighting or met Krillin, and he never would have learned about the wish-granting Dragon Balls, and etc, etc, etc. And by the way, did Chris ever figure out that Sonic copied a couple of elements from Dragon Ball or Dragon Ball Z? But anyways, what I'm really trying to say with all of this is, all of these story elements and motifs seem to have flown over Chris's head. And that's why I argue, in my subjective opinion, that I don't think Chris would have benefited from reading a book, in my opinion. The only way that I can see Chris benefiting from reading a book is if someone explained to him how a book should be interpreted or read, or how to see the story elements in general, and how to notice and catch these tiny details that apparently flies over Chris's head. Chris is not meant to read a book and be all like, oh, okay, that's a nice story or whatever, because that's not always how you really read a book, not all the time. The only time that I feel a book is meant to be read in such a simple way are children's books, in my opinion. And this is why I think, in my argument, that it would not have made a big difference if Chris was an idle book boy, or a gamer, or a couch potato. No, because no one in the past explained to Chris that you're not supposed to be literal-minded with books, or take what you see on the TV as fact. And that goes double for religious texts, by the way. Ooh, cause in my opinion, religious texts are dangerous when you take them literally, in my opinion. I really wonder if Chris ever read any history books, especially when it comes to war of different beliefs and religions and ideologies. Does Chris realize that mankind has, throughout history, imposed its beliefs on other people and cultures throughout the ages? And I also wonder, did Chris ever read up on the history of socialism or Marxism? Is he aware of how many millions of corpses this ideology has produced each and every time it's been tried? And not only that, those nations that eventually did adapt socialism went out of business or dissolved almost always, each and every time. In this day and age, there are still socialistic nations, or rather, I probably should say, social democratic nations. And if they haven't gone out of business now, they eventually will go out of business later on in the future. Just like Venezuela. Now, what I'm really trying to say with all of this history talk is, when it comes to Chris, is there anything that he's well read in that is not Sonichu, Pokemon, or Sonic? Are cartoons and video games the only thing that he knows? This, in my opinion, is one of the reasons to why Chris never got a girlfriend or a wife and kids. Like, are you people familiar with the whole Christian and the Casey's dad phone call? Yeah, when Chris was talking to Casey's dad, or I probably should say to Liquid Chris in finger quotes, because the popular belief is that Casey's dad was, or could have been, in fact, Liquid Chris the entire time. But the way Chris was talking to him and to Casey about what if he was really married to her, and how Chris would have to make money for his wife-to-be and kids. And while I was listening to that 1 hour plus of modern day radio drama, Chris struck me as a know-it-all know-nothing. Chris shouldn't self-deceive himself into thinking that he knows everything, because he doesn't. How Chris should be thinking instead, in my opinion, is, what Socrates said, I know that I know nothing. But instead, Chris talks as if he knows what he's doing, as if he knows everything. Like what he thought the future was going to bring him, at least what he thought back in 2005/2007, what he thought the future was going to be like for him. But, flashback into the future, 2021, Chris was arrested. He's in jail. Now, since we don't have much time left for this podvid, I think the last thing I would like to bring up is I would like all of us to look back and reflect on Chris's actions and see if there's anything we can learn, so that future generations are going to look back at Chris and be all like, so, this Chris guy, he's an adult man with autism that ended up in jail because he's the end result of what happens when your autistic child is never properly taught or coached. And so, now that I've seen this Chris person, I am now gonna make sure that my autistic child never ever takes the same path as this Chris guy. Never. So, if there is anything we can all learn from Chris's giant book of the misadventures of Christian, if I may call it that, I don't want to call Chris's book an adventure. No, because he hasn't exactly gone through that, in my opinion. Chris has not gone through the full adventurous journey of life, if I may call it that, correctly, in my opinion. And that's why I call Chris's giant book of life the Misadventures of Christian. Because I am not reading about a proper adventure here. I am reading a misadventure. If I am using that term correctly, I hope. I mean, does misadventure mean an adventure that is not an adventure? Like, let's say, is misadventure an adventure that is misshapen, and the quote-unquote hero does not go through an adventure in the traditional sense, right? He goes through the same patterns that vaguely resembles an adventure, crudely, and it's a bit dark and the main character isn't very bright and so nice and what have you. Is that what misadventure means? I'm asking because I'm not a native English speaker, I'm not. But what I am really trying to say is, Chris's journey was not an adventure. It was an unadventure, if I may say so, in my subjective opinion. But anyways, what can we all learn from all of this? From Chris's smeared, holed, banged up, and partially empty giant book of the unadventures of Christian is, if you are someone, and especially someone with autism, that think that you know how society works, then you are in trouble, because you actually don't. You don't actually know how society works if you think that you know. I mean, these are two different things we're talking about here. When you think that you know versus when you actually know. They're two different things. And these are my takeaways from all of this, and my takeaway to why it wouldn't have made much of a difference if Chris was an idle book boy instead of a gamer or a couch potato. For you see, if no one is going to try to teach Chris on how to interpret literature correctly or what he's reading at the moment, then no, I actually don't think it's going to be much of a help for him if he doesn't realize what the book is actually trying to tell him, or what it's about, or how it should be read and why. And this is why I think reading for Chris is equally as dangerous when he's watching his Saturday morning cartoons when he was a kid. There is a possibility he's going to believe what he reads on Harry Potter or play out those fantasies. Well, okay, he's not a kid anymore. He's not a kid. He's not stupid, but who knows? Maybe he will, maybe he won't. Who really knows? But I actually don't know what the last chapters of Chris's life is going to be like, or how it's going to play out and end. You know, the curtains and what have you. And now that he's in jail, it doesn't seem to look good for him. And before time is going to flip us all over to that page or chapter, I really would like to hope and believe that the last chapters of Chris's life, or his unfolding, will end okay for him, I hope. Yes, I am well aware that he ran a guy over with his car once, and Chris sent out threats to trolls and got all pissy and stampy with them on the internet, and Chris doesn't know how to be nice back to people. I am well aware that a lot of people really want Chris's story to end badly for him after all that he's done and said, and understandably so. But in my humble opinion, I want Chris's jail time, or maybe soon prison time, to be the beginning of something good for him, like a road to recovery for him. I hope. Who knows? maybe 10 years later, when mostly everything Chris did is finally ancient history, and if the Yale system puts him through a social coaching program or whatever it's actually called, then Chris can live on his own, have a job, pay the bills, talk to people correctly, and finally, for the first time in his life, will finally be able to be free in every way. Except, of course, sadly not entirely free, because, you know, he still has that criminal record, so he's not gonna be completely free, but I think you understand what I'm trying to say here, today's listeners. So, poetically, Chris should have been free, at least in his early 20s he should have, but he couldn't. Why? Because no one was able to help him back then. I mean, you know, his parents babied him. Chris doesn't speak in normal, he speaks in autism, and sadly, as a consequence of bad circumstances, in his youth, Chris never had a chance to properly flourish. He never had a chance to reach his full potential, like... Are any of you, today's listeners / viewers, familiar with Dragon Ball Z? Did you watch or read the History of Trunks? If so, then did you notice the difference in power level of future Gohan versus present day Gohan? Future Gohan was much weaker than his present day counterpart. Why? Because, spoilers by the way, Goku dies in the future. And as a consequence, Gohan never had a chance to train with him. Goku was the only one who seemed to know how to unlock Gohan's potential. And so, future Gohan ended up being not as powerful as his present day counterpart, or even surpassing Goku. Present day Gohan trained with Goku, and so he became a Super Saiyan much sooner than future Gohan. And what I'm trying to say with all of this is Chris never reached his full potential, and I'm thinking, if someone out there, like a social coach or a teacher, whatever, was there for him to teach Chris and make Chris see, then Chris would have ended up in a much better place and not jail, and maybe soon prison, maybe. After all, the story of Christian, in my interpretation, is the story of a boy who wanted to be free, but couldn't, due to bad circumstances. But how will the story of Christian come to an end? Only time will tell. Thanks for tuning in, everybody. You will all hear from me again either next week or next month. I wish everybody good luck, good health, good holidays, or what have you, and take care of yourselves and your close ones. And so, bye bye for now, everybody.